So good afternoon. Many of you in political science, or most of you, do political science in this course, but some of you probably do history as well. May have heard of the phenomenon of a transnational or transnationalism, which was a little bit in vogue, or maybe it still is in vogue. This is the only approach to scholarship in terms of politics and in history. Well, quite frankly, it's just a fancy name for something that has been existing forever, so to speak. It's the most natural phenomenon that one can imagine. And in this particular course and in this particular lecture, we are, in fact, going to be talking about that phenomenon, since the first of our two lectures is dealing with the diaspora, the Carpatho-Rusin diaspora, in North America, primarily, not exclusively. And when I say North America, and I will mix up from time to time, we will be speaking primarily about the United States, because there were very, very few Carpatho-Rusins who came to Canada before World War I. So the first portion, or the first lecture, will deal with the diasporan problem, and then a comment toward the end, or maybe we'll move it into the second lecture, of the impact of what was going on in the United States and its interrelationship with the European homeland, bringing on and coming to the outbreak of World War I, which will be the topic of our second lecture. Now, Carpatho-Rusins were no strangers to migration, especially after 1848, that famous year that we discussed last time. The Revolution of 1848 included, amongst other things, the emancipation of the largest majority, or the vast majority of Carpatho-Rusins who were proprietary serfs. After 1848, they are no longer in that position, so they can, in fact, move around, since they were, at least in terms of their physical beings, quote-unquote, liberated from their landlords. Economic dependence is a different story, but legally they could move away from the lands on which they lived. That being the case, by the second half of the chronological 19th century, it was quite common for Carpatho-Rusin peasant farmers living in the northeastern portion of the Hungarian kingdom, and that's what I'll be always referring to this map here of the empire. So in the Hungarian half of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, it was quite common for them to spend 6 or 8 weeks each year working on the lowland plains of the heart of Hungary, if you will. It's all the Hungarian kingdom, mountainous areas, down here the plains. So you go there, you work 6 or 7 weeks in one harvest, then go back about this time in September and October for the second harvest. And this work on the Hungarian plains was not limited simply to Carpatho-Rusins who lived on the southern slopes of the mountains in the Hungarian kingdom itself, but also those who lived on the northern slopes of the mountains in the Austrian province of Galicia. Those were those Lemko-Rusins that I have referred to on several occasions already. The economic imperative for those north of the mountains to cross over and work, and of course this was the lowest part of the mountains, as I said in our earliest lecture, so it made it quite easy for them to do that. As a result, very close cultural, religious, and especially social contexts, including intermarriage, between Lemko-Rusins living north of the mountains and those living south in the Hungarian kingdom, in particular the Prešov region, was now normalized. Totally oblivious to the fact that they lived on opposite slopes of the mountains and in different, quote-unquote, halves of the Habsburg dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary. Now, on the one hand, this seasonal migration helped the economic status of families who remained in the homeland, in Carpathian Rus. Some of those who moved south temporarily even decided to stay there in the lowland plains of the Hungarian kingdom on a permanent basis. And so what we have, if we look at this map to the right, this shows present-day boundaries of Hungary, Croatia, Serbia, and Romania, but all of this was the Hungarian kingdom until World War I. This is the lowlands, the flat land, as flat as this table, area, very rich agricultural area. And so some of these Carpathorusins came down there and settled permanently, whether in what is now the Srem region, Slavonia of Croatia, or in the Vojvodina, which is part of Serbia, or here in the Banat, which is part of present-day Romania. The most important of these destinations for what became permanent immigrants, we can't say immigrants because they're coming from the same country, just moving from one part of the Hungarian kingdom to another. But the most important destination for these people seeking to improve their economic status was to go to that southern Hungarian region of the Vojvodina, which is right here, and is now in Serbia, as I said. And the two areas that they went to, I'll put Vojvodina down. So that's what that whole area was called. But within it, a very important county, Hungarian county, called the Bacska. The Bacska. Again, right in the center of this area of southern Hungary. By 1910, the number of these Carpathorusins who settled in the Vojvodina and also in the Srem region of eastern Croatia reached about 8,000. This Backa county, to repeat, was geographically part of and effectively an unbroken extension of the flat Hungarian plain, an area therefore endowed with incredibly rich soil and a very favorable climate for agriculture. And this was in stark contrast to where they came from in the Carpathian Mountains, which they still fondly remembered as the highlands, or Hornica as they called it. But as a result of moving and settling farther south, these Vojvodinian Rusins, or Vojvodinian Backa Srem Rusins, acquired a considerable degree of economic prosperity, allowing for activity other than simply having to work all the time just to survive materially. And so very early, they established an elementary school in their main settlement in the middle of the Backa region. It was actually called Ruski Kerestor. And that went back to the 18th century because some of these people came there and settled already in the mid-18th century. Very long or very old in-migration. Already then they had elementary schools, not only in that main village, but in a few others where they settled. And because these villages were in relatively isolated rural areas, they were not subject to the pressures of Magyarization, that assimilation process we spoke about last time, that had characterized urban life throughout the Hungarian kingdom, including those major towns and cities in the Carpatho-Rusin area up north, and in particular among the church, clerical, and secular intelligentsia in cities like Uzhhorod or Prešov. And so from the very outset, in the Vojvodina, or the Bachka, or the Srem, throughout this entire period that we're speaking about, in schools, for instance, the language of instruction remained the local spoken Rusin vernacular that they had brought from where they came from in the north. And it was factors such as these that made educated Vojvodinian Bachka Srem Rusins different from their brethren in the Carpathian homeland. They were not subjected to the same degree of Magyarization. Now, neither this seasonal labor migration, which I first discussed, into the Hungarian plain just in the summers, late spring and late summer for the harvest, neither that nor this permanent settlement in the Vojvodina or in Srem or in Banat adequately responded to the needs of peasant farmers back in Carpathian Rus in the homeland, who were, by the late 19th century, as I mentioned last time, suffering under increasingly dire economic conditions that had characterized the last decades of the chronological 19th century. And so, to resolve their problem, they looked elsewhere. And where was that elsewhere? America, and specifically the United States. During the last decades of the late 19th century, 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, the United States embarked on a massive program of industrialization. Most of the industrial plants and factories that opened their doors or were located in the northeastern part of the country. This was a particularly favorable area for heavy industry, since states like Pennsylvania had huge reserves of coal and iron ore that formed the basis of the steel industry, which was the major factor in enriching America's rapidly growing economy in the decades before World War I. The factories, the mines, the mills required a huge labor force, and to fulfill that need, new immigrants were encouraged to make their way to America's shores. By the way, this didn't mean that older immigrants from other parts of Europe, in particular England and Ireland, Germany, France, Scandinavia, they didn't stop coming, but we needed so many, so they had to bring more. And beginning in the 1870s, it was Southern, Central, and Eastern Europe that became a source, and soon the largest source, of immigration. For their part, American industrialists, in cooperation with ship owners, carried out a comprehensive advertising campaign and created an organizational network that actually reached right into the villages in Southern Europe, in Central Europe, in Eastern Europe, making it possible to bring tens of thousands of Italians, Greeks, Poles, Jews, Magyars, Slovaks, Romanians, among others. It is estimated that between 1890 and 1920, no less than 18.2 million immigrants arrived in the United States, still the largest movement of people in history. And of those 18.2 million, 7.5 million were from Austria-Hungary, from the Balkans, and from the Russian Empire. And among them were Carpatho-Rusins, of whom an estimated 225,000 arrived in the United States by the outbreak of World War I in 1914. When we speak of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, actually the largest percentage from the entire empire came from the region of southern Galicia and northeastern Hungary, literally right where Carpatho-Rusins live. That didn't mean that they were all Carpatho-Rusins, because in that area, in that larger area, were also Poles, Ukrainians, Slovaks, Magyars, and of course, as I said, Carpatho-Rusins. Now, initially, most of these immigrants were young males who did not intend to remain permanently in the New World. In that sense, they were like those Carpatho-Rusin migrant laborers going to the harvest in the Hungarian plain. The only difference is, instead of working for 6 weeks or 7 weeks, they went a little bit farther to the United States and spent a year, maybe 2 years. Enough time to make money in order to return home and do the thing that they really wanted to do, buy more land in order to support their families beyond just a subsistence level. And with those goals in mind, it is not surprising that there arose the so-called sojourner phenomenon. Sojourner phenomenon. What was this sojourner phenomenon? Well, the sojourners were immigrants who worked for a few years in the United States, then returned home for a while before returning again to the New World. And in these decades before World War I, migrating back and forth across the ocean was almost as common as the decision to return home. In fact, before 1914, it is estimated that 1/3 of all immigrants who came to the United States from Southern and Western Europe returned home permanently. So going back and forth in this era was very easy, much easier than today. Much, much easier. Visas, what's that? Permission to leave, what's that? Just go to the railroad station, sit on a railroad line, takes you to the ports of northern Germany or the northern Adriatic, all already set up by shipping companies allied with industrial plants in North America, and they arrived and they already had jobs. As for Carpatho-Rusins, there were sojourners, but in the end, the majority of those Carpatho-Rusins who did come stayed in the United States, and then some of the single men, if they didn't get married in the United States, those who weren't single sent for their wives and children to follow as family units. Of course, again, it was quick money. That was the object, with the result that Carpatho-Rusin peasant farmers were rapidly transformed into miners and unskilled laborers in heavy industry. The women who came also found work, mostly cleaning public buildings, working as domestic servants, operating boarding houses, or taking up jobs in light industrial enterprises, sewing, for instance. However, for most of these people, life in the United States was not what they expected. Working in steel plants and coal mines was especially physically demanding and dangerous. I remember one time I was in the Pittsburgh area, and in the midst of a nondescript North American mall, they still had some remnants of the old plants, and one of them was this big, gigantic cauldron, as a real cauldron, where steel workers very often slipped, fell into the cauldron, and that was it. So very dangerous were these jobs. And demanding, so that one immigrant miner wrote, "We came expecting to work in America, not under America." Now, Carpatho-Rusyn immigrants settled where the mines and factories were, so that by 1910, as high as 79% of them lived in the urban areas of the Middle Atlantic states, and that would be, in particular, Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, and then a few more in southern Connecticut and Ohio. So it's especially this area around Pennsylvania, if you will. Pennsylvania in particular, why? Because in the eastern part of the state there were coal mines, and in the western part of the state, iron ore. So they would ship the coal, get the iron ore in the western part of the state. And the most important settlement, of course, was Pittsburgh. Although the work schedule for immigrant laborers was long, 10 to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, one day remained sacred, even in materialistic America. That was Sunday, when the vast majority of Carpatho-Rusyns were drawn to church. Now, at the time of their arrival, virtually all Carpatho-Rusyns were Greek Catholics. And we know what Greek Catholics are. That's that church in between Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism. And in that sense, as Greek Catholics, they were no different from the Ruthenian, or later Ukrainian Greek Catholics throughout all of Galicia. So they were all one group, if you will, religiously. Whether they lived in the Austrian province of Galicia or whether they lived in the northeastern area of Hungary, of the Hungarian kingdom. Now, we also saw last time how some of those Galician Ruthenians came to consider themselves Russians. Others came to consider themselves Ukrainians. And in fact, it was these different national identities. The peasants, they came, we were just Greek Catholics. But in America, they started to have to, first of all, very often you had to respond who you are and where you come from. So already there were kind of designations of your nationality. Or you were being asked in one sense or another. Or you were being dubbed as such by the larger American society. Of course, it is true from the larger American society, all of these people were just low-level hunkies, or bohunks was the term. Not very important. They were just labor. But they did start to make the distinctions between these bohunks or these hunkies, their various nationalities. And so, you know, you came to identify, or you from the outside world, you had to have some kind of identity. And so, as I said, many of those national identities were actually, in some sense, made in America. The point to remember is that Austria-Hungary's Ruthenian immigrants, who then later evolved into distinct Carpatho-Rusyn, Russian, and Ukrainian communities, at least initially functioned all together as Greek Catholics. There was a problem, however. Until the mid-1880s, there was not a single Greek Catholic priest, and certainly no church in the United States. And even after the first parishes began to be formed, Many places where Carpatho-Rusins lived still did not have their own priests or their own churches. And so the Greek Catholic faithful were forced by circumstance to attend Mass in a Roman Rite church. When it was possible, they would gravitate toward churches that served fellow Slavic immigrants like Poles and Slovaks. But Roman Catholic churches were not their church. And not content with such a situation, some enterprising immigrants wrote to Europe, to the Greek Catholic bishops in Europe, whether in Prešov or in Mukachevo, requesting that they send them priests. And the first priests did arrive in America in 1884, and several others followed. By 1894, 10 years later, at which time there were nearly 24 Greek Catholic priests in the United States. By the way, all of them but 4 of them were actually Carpatho-Rusins from the Hungarian kingdom. So the Galician presence in the priesthood was limited. You'll see why that's important. It's important to note here that the immigrants themselves, not the church in the homeland, took the initiative to invite a priest and establish a parish church. And then in the absence of their own bishop, these immigrant faithful created a committee or committees or councils made up of secular people, not religious people, lay people, secular people, which purchased property and built a church. And so it was these secular lay councils which legally owned the churches, not the bishop, and that differed completely from standard Catholic practice in the Orthodox world. In this case, they were acting like Protestants. You know, they go out, buy a piece of property, build a church, invite a priest. In the Catholic world, all churches legally belong to the bishop that is in charge of a particular area. This question of property, church ownership, was in the future to plague relations between the Greek Catholic clergy and its hierarchy and the lay faithful who went to church. Who owns the property? Who makes decisions? Now, aside from churches, another type of organization that was created by these early Carpatho-Rusin immigrants were the so-called fraternal benefit societies. Fraternal benefit societies, popularly known as brotherhoods, even though the brotherhoods also had sisters, females who were members, and children who were members. But popularly they were known as bratstva, brotherhoods, technically fraternal benefit societies. Well, what were these things? These newly arrived or recently arrived immigrant workers quickly realized that in the United States, neither their employers nor the government, and that could be whether at the local level or the state level or the federal level, neither of them provided any meaningful social services. And faced with this American reality, immigrant workers created self-help fraternal societies, or these brotherhoods, to which they contributed a small amount of their wages each week or month. Once a society was established, any member who fell ill, or who was injured, or who was killed, this is a pretty good likelihood, received a certain amount of money to compensate him and his family. Such brotherhoods were established in many communities where Carpatho-Rusin workers lived. And in order to increase their effectiveness, several of these brotherhoods, individual ones, joined together to create larger organizations. And among the oldest of these came about when in 1892, 14 of the local brotherhoods in eastern Pennsylvania joined to form something called the Greek Catholic Union of Rusin Brotherhoods, literally, the Greek Catholic Union of Rusin Brotherhoods. That was its formal name. By the outbreak of World War I, this Greek Catholic Union had nearly 54,000 paying members registered in both adult and youth lodges. So it's quite large. And it wasn't the only one. There were several other of these brotherhood organizations that came into being. This was just the largest, oldest and largest. Now, aside from providing insurance benefits to its members, these brotherhoods also published, in the Rusin language, newspapers, an annual almanac. These publications were sent to all members as part of their annual dues. And the oldest and largest of these publications was the newspaper called the Amerikansky Ruski Vestnik, the American Rusin Bulletin, that was published by the Greek Catholic Union. Now, as these names suggest of the Greek Catholic Union and others that also use the term Greek Catholic, these early brotherhoods, although secular in origin, were in fact closely allied to the Greek Catholic Church. Priests were not only among the members, but also sometimes elected officers of these organizations. And those brotherhoods not only gave assistance to their own working class members, but also started to provide some assistance to individual churches. What did that mean? Well, the brotherhoods eventually became involved in church politics. Now, this unity, as I mentioned, that brought all Greek Catholic immigrants from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, whether they were from Austrian Galicia or from northeastern Hungarian Kingdom, when they first came to the New World, well, that unity quite quickly ended. The divisions were caused by conflicts over religious orientation and national orientation. And aside from that, not surprisingly, they often were made sharper and unreconcilable because of personal antagonisms. The earliest conflicts, however, were caused by religious problems. As members of the Catholic Church, because that's what Greek Catholics are, there was a requirement for every newly arrived Greek Catholic priest who comes to the United States, they had to report to the local hierarch, that is, the local bishop in the territory where they were going to serve. Well, they had no bishop, and so they had to report to the local Roman Catholic bishop. Now, Roman Catholic bishops in the United States at this time, mostly of Irish descent, had little or no awareness of the Eastern Catholic Rite. What is this? Isn't everybody Roman Catholic? If you're Catholic, you got to be Roman Catholic, no? So they had no idea, many of them. And then when they found out about these Greek Catholics and their traditions such as married priests in a celibate Catholic church? What? And as a result, in some cases, they weren't recognized, and Greek Catholic priests were forbidden to perform their sacramental duties, forbidden to perform baptisms or weddings. They were not even allowed to consecrate the dead in Catholic cemeteries. Very often, someone would die, they go to a Catholic cemetery and it had to be down at the end of the cemetery, you know, where it runs down into a river or somewhere. Just not a, it couldn't be among proper Catholics. Now, one Greek Catholic priest, a man named Alexei Toth, he was serving in a Greek Catholic parish, of all places, in Minnesota. I mean, we've been speaking about the concentration of them in the Middle Atlantic states, but there were a few communities elsewhere, including way out there in Minnesota, specifically in Minneapolis. Now, this priest taught, like many others, Greek Catholic priests in these years, experienced dismissive treatment from the Roman Catholic Archbishop of St. Paul. Very high position, and one of the most influential figures in the Roman Catholic world at that time in the United States. Guess what his name was? John Ireland. But of course. And so he meets with him. They don't hit it off, to say the least. And when all efforts at reaching some kind of compromise between these two failed, because Toth came and he wanted to be recognized, it didn't work out. What did Toth do? He decided to leave the Catholic Church and to enter into communion with the Orthodox Church. Now, this Toth, before coming to North America, was a professor of canon law, so he understood all the legal implications of what it meant to be Greek Catholic in the larger Catholic world. And he justified this decision through legalistic and historic arguments. And the explanation was that he and his parishes were, quote unquote, returning to the faith of their fathers. After all, the Greek Catholics only came into existence in the late 16th and mid-17th century, when some of their leaders decided voluntarily to enter into union with the Catholic Church. And they maintained all of these Orthodox traditions. Well, now they can't maintain these Orthodox traditions, and so they're going to return to the faith of their ancestors. Now, this Toth did not limit his efforts to the return solely of his parish in Minneapolis. With the blessing of his new Episcopal Superior, and who was his new Episcopal Superior? He had to travel to San Francisco. Where in San Francisco? That was where the base was at that time of the Russian Orthodox Church in North America. Why in San Francisco, by the way, one might ask? Well, the Russian Orthodox Church was established way back in the 19th century in Alaska, because Alaska belonged to the Russian Empire. It was only sold to the United States in 1867, and when that happened, the Russian Orthodox parish in the United States moved from Sitka, Alaska to San Francisco. So that's how we have this little story of the Russian presence in California. And so this Toth is now Orthodox, and he sets out to bring other Greek Catholic parishes into the fold of the Russian Orthodox Church. And by 1909, he succeeded in bringing over 25,000 Greek Catholics, most of them Lemko-Rusin immigrants from Galicia, into the Orthodox fold. In fact, by World War I, and for several decades thereafter, the vast majority of members in the Russian Orthodox Church in North America were actually former Greek Catholics and their descendants from Austria-Hungary. So much so was their importance that the seat of the Russian Orthodox Church was then moved once again from San Francisco to New York, so that it would be in the center of this world. Now, aside from differentiation according to religious lines, there were other decisive factors. In particular, those brought about because of regional allegiances and nationality preferences. Those Ruthenian immigrants from Galicia, who did not like the policies of the Greek Catholic Union, which was primarily created by Ruthenians or Greek from the Hungarian Kingdom, and they led it basically. Those from Galicia broke with that organization, the Greek Catholic Union, and established their own fraternal societies. And those fraternal societies from Galicia either adopted a Russian national orientation or a Ukrainian national orientation. And so you had organizations like the Russian Brotherhood Organization or the Ukrainian National Association. And then finally, in 1908, Greek Catholics in the United States got their first bishop. His name was Soter Ortynsky. So we have Toth, and now we have Soter Ortynsky. Now, this Soter Ortynsky, the first of the first bishop, specifically for Greek Catholics, well, all of them were happy initially, but that didn't last long. And that was because the very influential and still oldest and still largest Greek Catholic Union representing these Carpatho-Russians from the Hungarian Kingdom, after greeting him when he arrived on the ship in the New York harbor, soon after became opposed to him. Why? Their reasoning was twofold. Ortynsky was from Galicia. I guess that was already bad in and of itself. It really meant that he wasn't from the Hungarian Kingdom. But even worse, he seemed to favor the Ukrainian national orientation. One alternative for parishes and priests who were discontent with their Galician Ukrainian bishop was to join the Orthodox Church. The Orthodox Church was always out there. And if they did that, they would both return to the faith of their fathers and more likely than not be part of a Russian institution. From the beginning, this return to orthodoxy was accompanied by an acceptance that one's nationality, and now they started calling themselves Carpatho-Russians, or simply Russians. Now, this friction within or among Greek Catholic immigrants, whether it was because of their regional orientation, that is, Galicia versus the Hungarian Kingdom, combined with defections to orthodoxy, and in part that was a reaction to the alleged Ukrainian orientation of this Bishop Ortynsky, all of this so alarmed the Vatican. There's all this division within the Catholic world, albeit the Eastern Rite Catholic world, so alarmed the Vatican that it decided in 1916 to create separate church jurisdictions. One for Greek Catholic immigrants from Galicia, Austrian Galicia, mostly Ukrainians and Lemko-Rusyns who didn't yet become Orthodox. The other was for those from the Hungarian Kingdom. And these were mostly Carpatho-Rusyns as well as Slovaks, Magyars, and Croats, whoever else was in the church. And from then on, until the present, there are, from 1916 to the present, two separate communities of former Greek Catholics in the United States. Carpatho-Russians on the one hand, and Ukrainians on the other. And they live as if they're in two different worlds. I can imagine that this has been a bit heavy. So I'm going to stop this lecture now and talk about the international implications of this, and moving us into World War I when we return after our break.